Okay, I'm gonna get us started, and there might be more people joining along the way. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining. So this is the first webinar of a series of 3, where we'll be exploring the bank's responsibility in the climate crisis, as well as other forms of destruction. And we'll also touch on what you can do about it. So in this first webinar, we're going to cover how the banks have been supporting destruction through their financing for the fossil fuel industry, but also arms trade. And we will cover and explore the links between fossil fuel extraction, climate change, and war and violence. So we have 3 amazing speakers on this webinar. I will introduce them before they speak. So we have about half an hour for these 3 speakers to cover different topics. And after that, we'll have about 20 minutes of questions. So there's different ways for you to participate in this webinar. Please make sure that you're muted throughout the time of the webinar so that everyone can hear the speakers loud and clear. As I said, there will be time for questions at the end of the 3 speakers. But if at any point you really have a burning question that needs to be clarified before this time, feel free to ask it. The best ways for you to ask questions is that you can either put a star in the chat box like this. And I will take a stack and I will come to you to ask your question. But feel free to also just type the question in the chat box if you would rather do that, and I will read it out loud for our speakers to take it on. Great. So I hope this is all clear. I'm now gonna leave it to our really good speakers to cover the different topics. So we're gonna get started with Alison. So Alison Kirch is the lead researcher on climate and energy at Rainforest Action Network based in the US. And she's going to cover the bank's financing of fossil fuels mainly. So Alison, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks Lise, and hi everyone. Let me share my screen so that hopefully you can all see this presentation. Okay, great. Yeah, so as Lise said, I'm Allison. I'm based in San Francisco working at Rainforest Action Network on bank fossil fuel financing. We're going to talk about what that means. So to start at sort of the most basic level, fossil fuel projects need a few things to get built. One, they need permits, and those are issued by governments. And at least where we are in the US right now, we have an administration that's super pro fossil fuels. So it feels difficult for that to be an avenue for change. Fossil fuel projects also need funding, often from private banks or public banks, and they need insurance to be built. They need to verify that they have insurance. So Rainforest Action Network works a little bit on the insurance side as well, but for today, what we're going to focus on is that middle piece, which is funding from banks. So to give you a little bit of background on all this, I'm going to use a report that Grande puts out with BankTrack and other organizations every year called Banking on Climate Change, the annual fossil fuel finance report card. And this version came out in March of this year. So in this research, we do 3 main things. One is we calculate bank financing for fossil fuels. So how much are banks lending and underwriting the debt and equity issuances for companies active in different parts of the fossil fuel sector. We look at bank policies. So do they have any proactive policies to restrict that financing? And we score those. And we highlight particular case study fossil fuel projects and companies to really look at how these impacts touch down on the ground. So here are some of the key findings, and they're not pretty. 33 big private banks that we looked at funneled 1.9 trillion, it's trillion with a T, into fossil fuels since the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2016 through 2018. And another worrying part of this is that that financing from these banks overall was actually on the rise all 3 years. So let's dive into who we're talking about here. This chart shows you who are the top 12 fossil banks since the Paris Agreement. And you'll see JP Morgan Chase comes in at #1 by a pretty significant margin, followed by Wells Fargo, Citi, B of A, etc. If we look at this list, one thing you'll notice is that it's pretty US-centric. This was a surprise even for us folks based in the US, I think. So for the top 4 slots are all US banks. All of the 6 big US banks that we looked at are in the top 12. But of course, there are other super important regional players. So Barclays is the worst in Europe, RBC is the worst in Canada, MUFG is the worst in Japan, and we've got other Canadian and Japanese banks showing up in the top 12 as well. And again, this is financing for the fossil fuel sector at large. So we looked at over 1,800 companies across all sort of steps of the fossil fuel life cycle. Another slice of data that we looked at, though, is we zoomed in on 100 fossil fuel companies whose expansion plans most fly in the face of the Paris Agreement. And that is because science and carbon budget research has shown us that we really can't afford to expand the fossil fuel industry. As they say, when you're in a hole, stop digging. So here we looked at financing for 100 companies that are particularly ravenously digging us deeper into the fossil fuel hole. And you'll see that the bank list is pretty similar. There's still JP Morgan Chase at the top by an even bigger margin, a bunch of US banks, multiple Canadian, mostly because of their financing for tar sands, some Japanese banks, and Barclays and Deutsche Bank from Europe. So the last way that we sliced and diced this data was to look at bank financing for different sort of particularly disastrous types of fossil fuels. So whether that's tar sands, which is the super thick and sticky oil that is mined in Alberta, Canada, to oil and gas drilled in the Arctic, to coal mining and coal-fired power. This is where we looked at who in particular is banking those companies active in these types of fossil fuels. Part of this slideshow didn't load. One moment, let me reload. Sorry about this. I'm going to stop my screen share for 1 second and reload and then come back to you all. Okay. Let me share screen again. Okay, sorry about that. So if we just dig into this for a moment, we'll see that tar sands, fracking, and ultra deep water are dominated by North American banks. Coal is dominated by the Chinese banks, perhaps not surprising, as you may have heard in sort of the narrative around coal. The other sectors are a bit more of a mixed bag, but you do see a lot of European banks rising to the top here as well. So lastly, I'll just speak for a minute about a particular case study so that we can see how this touches down. So this case study takes place in the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas. It's right on the border of Mexico, as south as you can get while still being in the United States. And there are 3 proposed liquefied natural gas terminals for this area. And in case you don't know, liquefied natural gas is when you take gas and you cool it down to such cold temperatures that it actually becomes a liquid, which you can then ship more easily on big tankers. And the United States is currently aiming to become an exporter of, major exporter of gas, because with the fracking boom, we have so much gas and we want to liquefy it and ship it to all sorts of countries through these sorts of terminals that liquefy the gas. So the biggest of these terminals that I'll focus on is called Rio Grande LNG, and it also would come with its own major pipeline. All 3 of these terminals, they're really right next to each other on a green field, so undeveloped area in South Texas, on what is often called the last clean beach in Texas. And some of the risks that would come with building these projects, of course, include the climate implications. not just of the terminals themselves, but once you have these terminals, you need to feed them with more gas, which incentivizes fracking. There's also real ecosystem damage threats. In particular, for these areas, there's endangered species at risk, indigenous rights violations, and community and health impacts, given that these are proposed in an area where shrimping, fishing, and ecotourism are some of the major industries, which would all be threatened by these terminals. So they're bad projects. We don't want them to go ahead. The local communities don't want them to go ahead. What's the bank angle here? So currently these projects are still proceeding through the regulatory process, which also means that they do not yet have their financing lined up. What they do have, or at least what some of them have, are financial advisors who have already contracted with these companies to help them get financing. And in the case of the Rio Grande LNG project, that's Société Générale from France and Macquarie from Australia. So we need these banks to end their relationship with this company, to not help it find financing. And we also need other banks to stay away from the deal, especially because we know that the second they get their permits, these companies are going to be moving much more purposefully into looking for financing from banks. And so we need the banks to sort of be aware about these projects so that they know to stay away. So Rainforest Action Network, a local group called Save RGB from LNG, Faux France, Friends of the Earth France, and a bunch of other groups have been doing exactly that, everything from inside engagement to protests to reports, to sort of bring attention to these projects and intervene in the bank financing of them. So that's all I have. And here are some links if you want to read more about any of these pieces that I went through or take action. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, Alison. That was great. As I said, we'll have quite a bit of time towards the end for questions. So if you have any questions for Alison, maybe keep them in the corner of your brain for now, and we'll have time for this at the end. I also forgot to mention that we are recording this webinar, so don't worry too much about taking notes. You'll be able to access all of this after the webinar. Great. So we're now going to move to our second speaker. So it's Uda Amori. Uda is a campaigns officer at Palestine Solidarity Campaign. She's in charge of the national BDS campaign based here in the UK. And during this webinar, she's going to cover how banks have been financing another type of destruction through financing arms trade, and kind of connecting the dots between fossil fuel extraction, climate change, and war and violence. So Uda, the floor is yours.
Hi everyone, thank you for having me, and I'm so glad to be speaking amongst all of you and to work alongside a lot of you in the same field, campaigning for these banks to not be funding such atrocities in the world. So I will, as Lee said, be focusing more on the investments from banks and the financing of banks in situations like Israeli apartheid and the oppression of the Palestinian people. So I will share my slides. Okay, one moment. Share. Can everyone, is that good? Yeah, okay. Okay, so I'll begin from the start. My name is Uda Amori, as was said. So I want to begin because I'm aware that a lot of people here might not know a lot of the background or the context of the situation in Palestine. So I'll just give a 2-minute overview on that for those of you who don't know. So essentially, I'll try and break it down as much as possible to fit it into the time. But in 1948, the Zionist militia, backed by many Western countries, including the UK, went into Palestine, where the indigenous population of Palestine lived, the Palestinian people. And it was in the quest to make a Jewish homeland within Palestine, although 90% of the population, 97% of the population in Palestine were not Jewish. So in order for this to happen, they had to be ethnically cleansed. So the Zionist militia came in and expelled over half of the Palestinian population from their homes, destroyed numerous towns and cities. Over 500 cities and villages were destroyed. Schools, communities were destroyed. And most of the Palestinians were forced to become refugees and live in the corners of historic Palestine. Later in 1967, Israel continued to occupy the remaining Palestinian territories and also continued to expel Palestinians from their homes. That's actually in 1967 was when my father was expelled alongside his younger brothers and sisters whilst they were sat in the front of their house. The Israeli military came in, started shooting, and the only option for them was to run from the back of their house with just the clothes they had on their backs, no shoes or anything else. And this is the reality for most Palestinians. It's this constant ethnic cleansing which is occurring to make way for these ever-expanding illegal Israeli settlements. And this system continues to this day. So, as I mentioned, in the West Bank, they're under brutal occupation, where for people to go to work or Palestinians to go to their own school, they will have to go through a checkpoint, and maybe they'll be held up for hours at a checkpoint. And it's at the power and discretion of the occupying power, Israel, to decide what to do with that Palestinian at any given time. Many women, for example, have given birth at checkpoints because they will not be allowed to go to a hospital. And then we look at Gaza, where Gaza has been under a brutal siege by Israel for over a decade. And during this decade, they've had 3 massive bombardments. One of the most noticeable ones being in 2014, where Israel killed over 2,000 Palestinians, including 500 children in 51 days. And the population in Gaza are made up of 80% of the population. There were refugees from other parts of Palestine who were previously expelled from their homes in 1948 or 1967. And since the 30th of March 2018, Palestinians in Gaza have been marching to the fence, which has entrapped them under this brutal siege because they're not allowed to leave, to demand their rights to return to their homes, which is a right enshrined under international law. And Israel has met them so far with brutal live fire, sniping down and killing over 250 Palestinian protesters and injuring over 30,000. And often, and this is where a lot of the military part comes into this, the Israeli military will use bullets at such high velocity bullets at a range where they know if you shoot someone in the leg at that range, then the leg will have to be amputated. There's no other way to rescue the individual. So they've deliberately disabled many young people, including budding footballers, in an attempt to deter people from practicing their rights, which we all are allowed to have, to protest for their freedom. And this is why in 2005, Palestinians have faced a long time occupation and brutality by Israel, and there was no peace process or any supposed negotiations were made to be anything, and their situation remained the same and just remained to worsen. So they called on the international community to boycott, divest and sanction Israel as a non-violent means to pressure Israel into complying with international law and the basic principles of human rights. And these include 3 demands: for Israel to end the occupation and colonization of Palestinian territories, including dismantling the apartheid wall and lifting the siege of Gaza; for the Palestinian citizens of Israel to have equal rights as their Jewish counterparts; and for Palestinian refugees to have the rights to return to their homes. All of these demands are, again, as I said, enshrined under international law. And this brings me now to the focus on banks, and especially in our particular case right now, HSBC. So we have done a lot of campaigning around HSBC with BankTrack as well, which has been great, which I will get onto. But we describe this as the chain of complicity. And I think before, Alison, you mentioned about the governments, the banks and the insurance, and I think it's quite similar in the case of the complicity with Israel's regime. You've got the governments making contracts and deals and importing and selling weapons to and from Israel's arms trade, where often Israeli arms companies market their weapons as battle tested because they've been tested on Palestinian civilians. So Israel essentially uses Gaza, where they're trapped in this massive humanitarian crisis and have been marching for their rights, as a live testing site for their weapons and their arms trade. And our government continues to buy and sell weapons from them, despite having full knowledge of this, and Israel uses this as a strategic advantage in the global arms trade. But when we look at the chain of complicity with banks, we see that banks are investing hundreds of millions and providing financial services worth billions of pounds to these companies who are arming Israel directly. And then these companies, and then we end up with the end product and end use, which is against Palestinian populations or other populations across the world, whether it's being sold to Saudi Arabia or Turkey, used against the Yemeni population, Yemeni civilians, as well as the Kurdish. And we will see, and I'm sure you find this with fossil-free campaigning, a running theme of corporate responsibility always being used by these banks, despite their investments saying another thing. And we know that we have the UN Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights, which states that, which is meant to be based on the pillars that the state has a duty to protect against human rights abuses by third parties, including businesses, and includes the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. And also HSBC, like other banks, but on a higher level than other banks, often brags a lot about their ethics and their policies, and sponsors a lot of what you would deem ethical and progressive events in order to enhance this branding. And despite having this corporate responsibility branding, they invest over 830 million in and provide loans worth up to 19 billion for companies arming Israel. So one of our main focus currently is Caterpillar. So HSBC invest around 100 million into the company Caterpillar, and they supply the Israeli army with bulldozers, which are weaponized and used by the Israeli Defense Force to demolish Palestinian communities, including schools, civilian infrastructure, including sewage pipes and water pipes, etc. It's also used in the construction of Israel's apartheid infrastructure, including the illegal settlements and the apartheid wall, and it's also been used as part of Israel's military pressure cooker procedure, which means for a Palestinian, often as a Palestinian, you will get maybe a month's notice by the Israeli military if they want your house gone. And this could be a house that you've had for hundreds of years, and they will say you've got 1 month to demolish your own home or face the cost it costs the Israeli military to demolish your home. So often Palestinians will resist and say, well, no, I'm not going to demolish my own home. You're going to have to force me out. And in this case, the Israeli military will start the pressure cooker procedure, where they'll begin by yelling into the house and saying, you have to surrender. If they refuse, they'll start to use small artillery, working their way up to tear gas grenades, etc. If at this point they still refuse to surrender, a Palestinian or Palestinian family, they will use a weaponized bulldozer, Caterpillar bulldozer, to shake the house until it crumbles and the Palestinian family is killed alongside the house being demolished. And these are all known breaches of international law. You can read here the different things it goes under, but I will skip this because I don't want to go too over my time. And again, going back to social responsibility, we know that HSBC have certain policies which say that they shouldn't be involved in sourcing, providing financial services or sourcing from suppliers involved in illegal operations or the exploitation of people and communities, which is exactly what we see companies like Caterpillar doing. And Caterpillar's own code of conduct, which you can read for yourself, the irony that we believe that our success should also contribute to the quality of life and the prosperity of communities, and we avoid those who violate the law or fail to comply with the sound business practices we promote. And we find this with literally every company we campaign on, the same similar style of policies or conduct without the actual due diligence and action. So far in the campaign, we've had several days of actions where we have over 40 groups across the country who take action outside HSBC branches. We've sent numerous emails into HSBC, and as well as having national protests regularly, we also protest outside and inside the AGM, which we did last time with BankTrack, which was a massive success. And the idea was stop funding destruction, whether that's the climate breakdown, whether that's the oppression of Palestinians or the arms trade as a whole. Banks should not be investing in any form of destruction, and we're going to team up together because we were definitely stronger together. And I think that was a beautiful act of solidarity between us both. And last year, we actually had our first success. So they announced that they divested from Elbit Systems, which was one of our core targets, which is Israel's largest arms company, who do market their weapons as battle tested, as I mentioned before, because they test them on Palestinian civilians. So that was a great victory for us. But obviously the campaign continues because there's still hundreds of millions and billions going towards companies who continue to arm Israel. And we just recently had another successful day of action. So that's it from me. That is my email if you want to get more involved, or you can follow us at Palestine Solidarity Campaign. But we have time for question and answers at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Uda. That was really, really great. Great. So we're now going to move to our last speaker before you all get to ask questions to the three speakers. So the last speaker is Claire Hamlet. She's a climate campaigner at BankTrack, based in the UK. And she will cover in this last presentation how banks have been responding to the climate crisis, and how they should be responding to the climate crisis. And she'll also introduce the Foster Banks No Thanks campaign and its objectives. Claire, you can go.
Thank you. Okay, hi everyone. Thanks to Huda and Alison for those really nice talks. So I'm just gonna share my screen. Let's see if okay, so that's shared, and make it, okay, is that good? All right, so yeah, just to maybe, well, firstly, just to connect with something that Uda was saying a little bit as well, like, yeah, with a lot of these policies we see from banks that cover human rights, obviously FPIC, for those who don't know, is like for that they need to seek free, prior and informed consent from communities or companies do before you know, pursuing a project. So like in the case of building a new mine or something, or a new pipeline. And we do also see lots of problems around fossil fuel projects where this free, prior and informed consent is not really being effectively obtained by the companies building out this fossil fuel infrastructure. So that's definitely a clear link where there's like repeated violations of these policies that banks have for their clients between both arms trade and fossil fuel industry. So, okay, so I'm just going to tell you quickly what I'm going to cover. Well, Lee said, so firstly, what banks have been doing in response to the climate crisis, and what the Fossil Banks No Thanks campaign is pushing them to do. So just to give you a bit of context, Fossil Banks No Thanks is the main campaign that BankTrack is running at the moment. We've got support from more than 280 organizations from all over the world at this point. We've had actions with the Palestine Solidarity Campaign and others throughout the bank's AGM season, which happened in the spring, which was really great. And there's going to be big plans for that as well for next year. So you'll get to hear a little bit more about that on our next webinar next week if you join that one too. Okay, so how are banks responding to the climate crisis? So here's a few of the things that we hear quite often. So we support the Paris Agreement. A lot of them do, you know, officially like have a position of supporting the Paris Agreement. A lot of them will say things like, if we talk to them about coal, they kind of have the, you know, have got the message, oh, coal is bad, and will, you know, say some of the right things on that, but then they'll turn around and say, well, gas is fine. Gas is a transition fuel. We're going to need that. We see oil and gas as, you know, helping us reach a low carbon economy. And another thing is, well, we're signed up, we're signatories of certain voluntary frameworks and principles, and they use this to kind of reassure us that they're doing everything that they possibly could be doing to respond appropriately to the climate crisis. as you know, basically the veins of the economy. So so these are some of the common responses that we get from banks when we talk to them in person, or when we send them letters and they reply to our letters, and also things that we've heard at, inside their annual meetings that we went to in the spring. So just to give you a few examples of some of the voluntary frameworks and principles that they are signed up to. So one is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, otherwise known as the TCFD, is an initiative that was instigated by Bank of England, by Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, Michael Bloomberg, and a few others. And the idea is that it helps banks to basically understand the emissions intensity of their clients. So like a coal company, for example, how much, you know, or a company that has operations in coal, what are their emissions? So it helps them to understand that. But what they do is basically will try and find out from the clients or from the client's public reporting on their own emissions, how much they're actually financing emissions. And then that helps them decide where to allocate funds. So they might say, oh, well, this company is far too emissions intensive, so we won't finance them. I'm not sure if I don't think they're up to that point yet, though. They're still doing the accounting. And then there's the Principles for Responsible Banking, which is a recent thing that's been launched by UNEP-FI. So this commits the signatory banks to align with the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. But in aligning with the Paris Agreement, they're not actually required to end their financing for fossil fuels. So we've seen a lot of shortcomings in the Principles for Responsible Banking, and on BankTrack's website there's material on basically our response to that and the submission that we sent to UNEP-FI, basically criticizing a lot of aspects of the Principles for Responsible Banking. We've seen banks over the years commit to many principles that haven't really brought much in terms of concretely reducing their financing for the fossil fuel industry. So we're a little bit skeptical of this one as well. So that's some of those voluntary frameworks and principles. Some of the good news is that a few of them, mainly European banks, are making an effort to actually improve their policies around the fossil fuel industry. So in 2017, ING committed to bring its coal financing down to zero by 2025. And then this year, Crédit Agricole, the French bank, published a full phase-out plan for coal. So you can see from the picture on the right, they've committed to no new coal and €0 for coal in Europe by 2030, and then 2040 in China and 2050 everywhere else. So, you know, we can debate about the dates and whether this is like fast enough and so on. But the fact that they've come out with a quite detailed plan of how they're getting out of coal is quite a big move. So what we'd ideally like to see is other banks publish also like very detailed plans of when will they be out of coal, but then also when will they be out of oil and gas. So Crédit Agricole doesn't have a similar plan yet for oil and gas, but yeah, we're gonna work on getting them to do that. So there are a few good moves from banks, but none of them yet are on track to help limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And one thing, some of you might have seen it, Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, did say, I think it was last week, that from his understanding, banks are basically on track to finance, or the financial sector is on track to finance a 4-degree world. So we've got a really long way to go before banks are really on track to help limit warming to 1.5. So this brings me to what banks should be doing and the demands of the Fossil Banks No Thanks campaign. So here are our 3 demands that we have to the bank. So one is that we want them to be clear on their position on the relationship between climate change and fossil fuels. A lot of them don't say anything about fossil fuels when they talk about climate change, and we find that concerning, but they won't even acknowledge that fossil fuels are actually, like burning fossil fuels is actually the main cause of climate change. We want them to immediately end finance for fossil fuel expansion. So Alison talked a little bit about expansion in the fossil fuel industry. And for us, this means ending finance for any new fossil fuel projects, but then also ending finance for any companies that are planning to expand fossil fuels. So any companies planning to build a new coal plant or dig a new coal mine, for example. And then finally, it's to publish a time-bound plan for exiting the fossil fuel industry, as is by COP25. So we're aiming for more phase-out plans to come out, like the one we saw from Credit Agricole. Well, by next month. That's not gonna happen. But yeah, ideally, we want to see a lot more of these phase-out plans coming out over the next year in particular. So those are our demands and what we think that banks need to be doing in order to really bring their financing in line with the 1.5-degree pathway. This is just a map of our targets, so you can see which banks around the world we're targeting. So pretty spread out. We do have partners in a lot of these countries, and yeah, we've done already some really good work with them on having actions outside of banks' AGMs, writing a lot of letters to banks, having meetings with them, doing reports and that sort of thing. So yeah, so that's just the spread of targets at the moment. And then here's just a couple of resources just to add to the ones that Alison had. So obviously the Banking on Climate Change report, BankTrack's website has a lot of details on different fossil fuel projects and also on banks and which projects they finance and which companies they finance. And then fossilbanks.org, the campaign website, where you can go to find out more details on different banks and their policies, and as well like sign up to our call on banks to end their financing for fossil fuels and join our mailing list if you want as well, so that you can keep up to date with any activities that you can get involved in, again, which we'll hear a bit more about next week. So that's all from me. Thank you. I will just end my sharing. Okay.
Thank you, Claire. Great. Thanks again to all three speakers. That was really interesting and insightful. I'm now going to open the floor for questions. We have about like 15-20 minutes for this. So if you want to ask a question, you can either put a star in the chat box and I'll get to you, or you can type it directly in this chat box if you would rather do it like this. I'll take questions in stacks of 2 or 3 probably, and get back to our speakers to answer them. So if you have any question, now is your time. I'm going to go to Courtney first.
Hey, can you hear me? Okay, awesome. So that's great that you guys highlighted some of these voluntary principles that the banks are signing on to. Do you know if any organization is creating some mandatory requirements or some kind of statement so that we can, as consumers, look at banks and say, okay, they've signed this, so this means they're actually taking steps to end fossil fuel expansion, et cetera?
Thank you, Courtney. Are there any other questions? We can take them in little stacks before we get to our speakers. Okay. Well, while other people might be thinking about their questions, does any of our speakers want to answer Courtney's question?
Yeah, Alison can.
Okay, sorry, this is Alison. Hi, everyone. So I think when we're talking about things that would be mandatory for banks, that's when we have to go back to governments, right? Their regulators are the ones who can make things mandatory for banks. And so then that means that we're looking at a very case-by-case basis. So there's exciting things that I don't know super fine-grained detail on happening in France around regulations for not just banks, but companies more largely to report on their climate risk at a more sort of fine-grained detail. In the US, Senator Elizabeth Warren has proposed a climate risk disclosure bill that obviously is not moving forward right now, but maybe in the future could. So again, it really depends on jurisdiction and on what sort of who's in power. Theoretic, and that's part of the reason to go back to that, like, you know, where you can't make progress with governments, go directly to the corporations. That's part of the reason that a lot of the organizations on this call have been pushing for these voluntary industry standards to have more teeth, because, you know, banks are independent actors. A lot of them work in multiple jurisdictions. They're multinational, and so they can't just, you know, pass the buck off to the governments and say, regulate us. They need to be, you know, essentially regulating themselves. But of course, corporations don't really like to do that.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Alison. Claire or Uda, do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, I would add that although, yeah, there's not some framework that they have to sign up to, which will guarantee, like, if you looked at that and went, okay, cool, my bank has signed up to this, so I can feel like assured that they're doing enough on climate. Yeah, and that's, you know, and looking at what voluntary things they're signed up to is also not a way to guarantee that they're doing enough on climate. But of course, there is, like, banks that don't finance the fossil fuel industry or the arms trade at all, and we are going to cover that in the third webinar on November 6th. And just talk a little bit more about that. So, you know, if you're interested in who the good banks are, then there'll be details on that then.
Great, thanks for that explanation.
Yeah, I would just quickly add on to that. Yeah, I agree with all the points that have been said, and a lot of the times, not just with banks, like with universities, pension funds, etc. There's often a separation between what's been signed and what's been said and policies, and then when you actually uncover what's going on in the investments and where the loan's going, so a lot of it is follow the money, and you kind of, you know, you can find your answer. But there has been, obviously, for an individual or an individual campaigner to go and try and research every single bank's investments into great detail can be an extensive amount of work, which isn't necessary, because there's organisations like Grande produced a great report on deadly investments, which covered each bank's investments in the arms trade, the global arms trade, and BankTrack have done lots of work on this. So that information has become more and more available, and the targets are chosen based on a number of factors. For our case, and I'm sure it's the same for the fossil free campaign as well.
Thank you, Uda. Are there any other questions? No one else? Okay, in that case, it looks like we're going to finish our webinar well on time, which is pretty good as well, especially given the time, at least on this side of the globe. Great. So as I said at the beginning, the webinar was recorded. We will share the recording, so you'll be able to access. Apparently there's one more question. Okay, we've got time for one more question. So Karen, do you want to go? You're still on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, perfect. Good. Thanks a lot. Very useful presentation. I have a quick question on the figures that you mentioned. When you look at a bank, and I've picked up one figure, for example, which is HSBC providing syndicated loans worth up to £19 billion, which seems a lot for companies arming Israel. And that's just one example. But when you look at a bank, how do you actually, where do you get those figures from, and how do you compile them? And do you actually confront the figures that you end up with the banks themselves to make sure that they are accurate, or at least to get the feedback on the figures that you compile?
Uda, do you want to answer the specific one on HSBC, and then maybe Claire and Alison, if you want to talk about the banking on climate change report figures as well? Uda, you're on mute.
Still on mute. The figure of 19 billion is the value of syndicated loans. I didn't personally do the extensive research. I wish I could take credit for it, but I can't. But it was one, and we work with a number of different researchers who pulled together these figures. And since the report has been produced, we have spoken with HSBC at different occasions to say what is their response to these figures, had meetings with them about these figures, and they haven't denied and they haven't changed it either, apart from the first victory we had, which was them divesting from Albert Systems at the time. But yeah, I think it's very important, and all of these things, of course, referenced, documented and reported to be of use to campaigners and to be able to actually hold these banks and institutions to account on these different financial investments and loan financial services as well.
Thank you, Uda.
Thank you.
Claire or Alison, do you want to come in on the Banking on Climate Change report and the figures?
Sure, yeah. So on the fossil fuel side, most of our research is done on a Bloomberg terminal. So if you've ever seen like Wolf of Wall Street or any movie about Wall Street, you might recognize these like horribly ugly screens that they all look at when they're doing high-powered trades. And we have one of those in our office. And so we use that to look up loans and bonds and share issuances from these companies and then trace them back to the banks. We do share the findings in advance with banks in advance of publishing the report. We share how we're going to analyze the grades, their policies, and upon request, we also share the data that they're being tagged for. Some go back and forth with us at a very detailed level on that data, which in the end does help us get sort of a better picture of things. And some just disagree with our approach, which is kind of neither confirming nor denying the figures, just like Huda said. And at the end of the day, what we always say is, we are doing really thorough and purposeful research using information that is not quite publicly available because we pay for access to this data, but close to publicly available. And if you disagree with our numbers, you need to be more transparent about your fossil fuel financing. So it's sort of a catch for them because they don't want to talk about their fossil fuel financing or their arms trade financing or anything like that.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Alison. We've got another question from Tony.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Good. Question for Alison. Sorry, I didn't jump in before. I wasn't quite aware that you were involved in the gathering of research with your organization, which is fantastic. My question is about whether there's any way to access more specifics than are in the Banking on Fossil Fuels annual report. In particular, in Canada, we're very concerned about a proposed new tar sands mine called Tech Resources Frontier Mine. It would be fantastic to know who might be involved in it at this stage to try to make early pressure before government approves it, which we're expecting to happen any time after we have an election on Monday.
Yeah, totally. Thanks for that question, Tony. I'm well aware of the tech mine and how disastrous and crazy of a plan it is. So in general, in the report, we don't publish more details just because there's already way too much information in here for anyone to dig into. But generally, we are always available to provide that information for groups that are working on specific projects if we have it. In the case of tech, there is a little bit of information in the report on page 31. But if you want to follow up with me, I can put my email in the chat and I'll definitely be able to send you who's banking tech now. Again, similar to the RGV projects that I was talking about earlier, tech doesn't yet have the regulatory approvals, and so it's very much pre-financing stage, but we can look at who's banking the company right now, because that gives you a clue as to A, who is supporting the company through this regulatory process, and B, who might potentially fund a project in the coming years. So yeah, I'll chat in my email.
Thanks a lot, Alison. Do we have any last burning question? Okay, in that case, we're gonna wrap up. So yeah, as I said before, the webinar was recorded, so you'll have a chance to get through it again and get through the presentations. Feel free to get in touch as well if you have any other question. And also to remind you that this is the first of 3 webinars. So there's going to be 2 more each Wednesday for the next 2 weeks. So next Wednesday on the 30th of October, we'll be covering and exploring effective tactics against these banks, and more specifically direct action and AGM interventions. So we hope to see lots of you there. And in the meantime, I hope you all have a really nice evening and or day, depending on where you are. And thanks again to our 3 speakers. Thank you so much for making the time and sharing all this knowledge. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.